Okay. All right. So today's speaker is Masud, Haque, who is now in Maynooth, but is on his way back to Dresden. And he's going to talk about Eigenstate thermalization, random matrices, and Behemoths, which sounds like an interesting title. So, by the way, as usual, you can interrupt and ask questions as Masud is going along. So, feel free to not wait or request permission. All right, Masud, please.
Okay, good. So, so I have my previous affiliation here as well, which is a different institute in Dresden, where I was previously with same time as Achilles, overlapping for many years with Achilles. And the reason I have that as affiliation is that I started working on thermalization and so on when I was there, but also the main technical part of this talk will be on a paper which which we did with people who are still with people who are currently at the Max Planck Institute, and we did this work when I was visiting before the pandemic, when visits and so on were still possible. Okay, so this is how the slides are organized. So the first two parts are sort of preparatory parts or introductory parts. The first part is really for a very broad audience. It's examining the idea that you can think of many-body Hamiltonians as random matrices. And these exclamation and question marks are here because if you come from condensed matter physics originally, then you study the specific properties of different many-body Hamiltonians. So this is a really insulting statement. So then you should be slightly insulted. But I will, depending on how much time I spend on this part, I will justify the extent to which this is a serious statement. And then a more technical introduction is the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis, which many people know here. And the aspect I will talk about, want to talk about particularly, is which observables obey this ETH. So the eigenstate thermalization is formulated in terms of specific quantum operators, physical observables, which are described with specific operators. And then you could ask which operators it's true for. Okay, now and then once I've introduced this, I can talk about ETH in a scaling form, because I regard ETH as a scaling statement, something that you think of as you change the size of your system. And I will think of different observables and distinguish them. So the observables we're usually interested in physics, the physical observables are generally local. And I will also think about the complete other limit, which I call hugely non-local operators. So we call them giant behemoth operators. And going from one, there's a systematic way of going from one to the other. Okay, so this is how my slides are organized. And because I'm lazy and old, I don't change my slides very much for as long as possible. I just adapt how fast I go to the audience. Now, I don't know the audience here very well, but I was given to understand that it's more specialized than many others. So I will go through the first two fast. If you feel that there is something that you want me to go through slower, just stop me, because Achilles gave you permission that you can stop me, and I will just go through those slower, and we will just ignore the specialist people, right? If they're bored, then they're bored. Good. So this is based on papers. The introductory part especially are based on papers that were written long ago when I was in Dresden, and the part about behemoths is this particular paper, which is more recent, is still already 2 years old. So those beginning papers were mostly done with a postdoc, Wouter Beugeling, and this one was done with Ivan Haimovich and Paul McClarty, who you can see the very Russian-looking person and the very English-looking person correspond to those names. Good. So this is probably unnecessary given of what I understand of the audience, but all this is motivated from the physics of isolated quantum systems, which are of course completely an abstraction, right? There is no system which is completely isolated. And in fact, what we learn in statistical physics is the opposite abstraction. When we have a bath which has certain specific properties attached to our system. So we will think about this limit between isolation and a well-defined bath. And this limit has become relevant, was traditionally not really interesting from an experimental point of view, from accessible physical system point of view, but now has become interesting because there's more and more experiments where you can do measurements at time scales which are much smaller than the time scale of environment effects. And when this much smaller inequality becomes good, that's the limit of isolation. So that's why over the last couple of decades, it's become acceptable to talk about this limit. Okay, so and of course the experiments which have made these possible are mainly ultra cold trapped ions, but that's not the only example. So here I have an example from NMR quantum computing, where they did a version of many body localization, and also ultra fast form probe spectroscopy, which sometimes is reaching this limit, although most spectroscopy experiments are not really in a reasonable isolation approximation. Good. So having said that, I think I will move on to saying about giving the theorist's view of how I look at isolated systems. So a non-isolated system, something with a bath, something you would think about in a typical solid state experiment. So that would be what you describe with standard many-body quantum physics with Green's functions and RG and whatnot, right? And that type of physics looks at the low-lying parts of the many-body spectrum. So it's important to remember that in this talk, when I draw such cartoons, these will always be, each state is a many-body state. So they're not single particle states that you fill up with individual fermions. So I really mean many body states, right? Okay, so this is the part of the spectrum you'd be interested in if you were not in isolation. But being in isolation, if you start from some combination of eigenstates high up in the spectrum, shown in red there, then you stay in those states. Your dynamics is confined to those many-body states. And there is no tendency towards the ground state. So that means that any part of the spectrum can be important, and it's important to study the full spectrum, properties of the full many-body spectrum. So this is our motivation of much of what we'll do in this talk. So this motivates the study of the eigenstate in the full spectrum, and in particular in the middle of the many-body spectrum. And it turns out that mid-spectrum eigenstates in generic systems are usually random-ish. I have some qualifiers here, so we'll talk about those qualifiers. So we want to talk about random states, and we want to make comparisons with random states, which I use interchangeably with the idea of eigenstates of random matrices. So random matrices are used in many places outside statistics departments as well. Although they're really hot with both statistics and math departments as well, maybe because of the applications in many fields, not only in our field, but apparently there are books with the title of Random Matrices for Wireless Communications and so on, right? So it's really widely used. What's most important for us are random matrices which have real eigenvalues. So we either take them to be symmetric or to be Hermitian. And again, I assume that most people know all of this. So the two properties, actually, I will focus on three properties of these. The third I didn't write yet. I'll come to that. The first is that the eigenstates of random matrices have coefficients which, if you take the coefficients and draw a histogram, you get a Gaussian distribution. So this is an important marker of a random matrix. And the other is much better known, so I won't talk about that. I won't describe that. This is about the eigenvalue spacing, which is either GOE or GUE. Okay. So the many-body Hamiltonians that I will deal with in this talk will be lattice systems, meaning they have a finite Hilbert space, so that it's easy to talk about not just a bottom of the spectrum, but also a top of the spectrum, so that when I say mid-spectrum, that has a meaning. That has a so of course, people outside our field point out that this is highly artificial. Nothing in nature has a top of a spectrum, but we will ignore those people outside our field and assume, consider systems which have a bottom and a top. So and then typically this means that there are some number of particles in some number of sites. And when we talk about large size limits in this talk, we'll only talk about the regular limit, the thermodynamic limit, where you increase both, keeping the ratio constant. I have a strong interest in other types of limits. So keeping NP constant and increasing the number of sites. So you go to a zero density limit in a certain way, or keeping L constant and increasing the number of particles. If it's bosons, you can do that, or if it's spins, you can do that. And that's, you could call that the classical limit, because usually you'd reach a limit which you can describe classically. So in this talk, we'll just focus on the thing that this limit which is most familiar, again, especially if you come from a condensed matter background. So it turns out that such many-body Hamiltonians, so typically there will be few body and local interactions. It turns out that such Hamiltonians, even though these properties make Hamiltonians sparse and the elements are not random at all, here is an example, but we'll not bother with that. Again, due to the audience. So it turns out that even though these are not like GOE or GUE matrices, the eigenstate coefficients usually turn out to be Gaussian distributed. The energy eigenvalues turn out to be Wigner-Dyson distributed. The second is much better known. And those are the kinds of systems we'll mostly talk about. There are some exceptions. The exceptions are these, which are of interest to some people in the audience as well, but we'll mostly ignore those and talk about generic systems which obey the two things I've written on the top. So just to introduce notation, I give you an example of the first. So here is a model which this talk will mostly draw from, but there are a few other models that I'll give examples from. This is the XXZ chain, a spin chain, Heisenberg chain with some anisotropy with some next nearest neighbor interactions, which make the system generic. And I use the words non-integrable, chaotic, ergodic interchangeably for these. And then I would ask you please to remember this notation will be important. Will be the notation for eigenstates, and eigenstates will be expanded often in the computational basis. The computational basis means states like this. So I'll use this notation for that. So later we'll distinguish that from random matrix basis. So that's to introduce the notation. And then let's now say what the slide says. I want to look at the coefficients of many-body eigenstates. So I'll take eigenstates, take these coefficients and draw a histogram and look at the histogram for you. So that's done here. Actually, I scaled it a bit. Don't worry about that. I scaled the coefficients a bit, not to worry about that. On the left, you see a non-integrable system. And then I've taken coefficients from the middle 200 eigenstates and plotted the histogram in red. So that's a histogram, even though it looks like a curve. So even though I drew it not as a histogram, not not with bars, but as curves, so that I could show several things on this plot. And you see that it's a very good Gaussian. The black line is a Gaussian. If I take eigenstates from the top or from the bottom of the spectrum, then you see that there is strong deviation from Gaussian. The green and the blue lines don't look like Gaussian at all. So this is what should, if you were insulted when I said that many-body Hamiltonians are random matrices, this is what allows us to be friends again. Many-body Hamiltonians are random matrix-like in the middle of the spectrum. So near the edges, especially near the low energy part that a condensed matter physicist is interested in, it's nothing like a random matrix. Okay, so as you can imagine, in this talk, we'll not be so interested in the bottom. We'll focus on states far away from the bottom. And on the right, you see an integrable chain, so just the nearest neighbor Heisenberg chain. And here, even the middle of the spectrum is no longer has Gaussian distributed coefficients. So there is no random matrix-like behavior to see if you look at the coefficient distribution here. Very good. Questions? Okay. So this is one way in which you can see random matrix-like behavior. This is so much better known that I think I will not discuss it. Here you see through this R quantity that you get random matrix-like behavior when you have a chaotic system, generic system, when these two are roughly equal, and you have integrable-like behavior when one of them dominates. So let me not talk about that. The third aspect of random matrices that I didn't talk about till now is that if you take such a random state and then you calculate the entanglement between two halves, then you get something which you can calculate almost analytically. That's usually known as the Page value, after Don Page, who worked it out. Actually, I forget what his motivation was for that. And that's shown for different sizes with these dashed lines, the green dashed lines. And you see, if I take eigenstates, all the eigenstates, so I've done that for, this is a slightly different system, but don't worry about exactly what it is. If I take all the eigenstates and calculate the entanglement entropy for each, then I deviate a lot at the low parts, low energy parts and the high energy parts. And it's only in the middle of the spectrum that I almost reach the Page value, the random matrix value. And you can see what happens to the whole thing as I increase the system size. The Page value, that increases linearly. This is a change, so that's what's known as a volume law, whereas the bottom or the top of the spectrum, they follow L to the 0 behavior, so they don't increase at the same rate, right? So you see a difference between area law at the edges of the spectrum and the volume law at the middle.
What's the blue and red?
Sorry, say that again. Satko, say that again, please.
What's the blue and red?
Oh, sorry. So these are two different types of partitions. So one is just cutting the chain into two blocks. That's called block, red. And the blue one is comb, meaning a sublattice entanglement between the odd sites and the even sites. And you'd have expected if it was perfectly random matrix, then they would exactly match here. But you see the system still has some memory. They're not exactly the same. Also, they deviate slightly from the random matrix value. And this deviation actually persists as you go to the infinite size limit. So in the paper cited on the top right here, we have speculated on how to understand that deviation and its large size limit. Actually, if I go back, then what's happening? Sorry, I got kicked back by hitting the wrong button. If I go back to this, then you see there is also some deviation from the Gaussian in the coefficient distribution. And that's, I believe, more or less the same source as the fact that many-body Hamiltonians are not exactly random matrix like even in the center of the spectrum. although it's very close. That's really the dominant behavior. Good. So now I've talked about the middle of the spectrum, and you might think that random matrix thinking is only useful in the middle of the spectrum, but you can extend this to not the full spectrum, but most of the spectrum by introducing a temperature, which of course is really a big jump when in a system without a bath. So what you do is you simply pretend that the system is described by a canonical ensemble, canonical density matrix, even though it's not, right? That's how you introduce temperature. And then if you continue pretending, then you could define the total energy, right? So, and then, and everything here is defined as usual with canonical formula, even though it's completely inapplicable in the usual sense. There is no bath, the distributions are not thermal. But if you pretend this, then you get a relation between the energy and this temperature that I introduced. So I could just invert these, and this depends only on the eigenenergies. That's kind of funny. It doesn't depend on the properties of the eigenstates. So if I give you a set of eigenenergies, you could use this formula to attach with every energy a temperature. It just depends on this set of numbers. You could also do that for the eigenvalues of a random matrix. It doesn't care, right? So there is a temperature energy map. So there is a temperature energy map also for a finite isolated systems based on the eigenvalues alone. This is a pretty peculiar fact. So if I plot that temperature energy map, it typically looks like this. This is the bottom and top of the spectrum, and you can plot it either in terms of T or beta, and you naturally get negative temperatures, which are completely should be completely uncontroversial, but some people seem to get excited about them. So it just means that I have assumed that my universe has a top of energy, that my energies are bounded. In a universe, in the real universe where energies are not bounded, of course, you don't have negative temperature. Okay, so now that I have introduced temperatures, let's see what we can do with random matrices. So we've had mid-spectrum eigenstates well described by random states. So we gave examples of that. And now I extend that to say that, claim that the finite temperature eigenstates are well described by, you apply this function of the Hamiltonian with the temperature in it on a random state, and the state you get, if you normalize it, should describe well a finite temperature eigenstate, so a temperature away from the middle of the spectrum. So that's the way to get a random matrix description of states which are not at the middle of the spectrum. Okay, this seems a bit random, and to be honest, variants of this have appeared for some time in the literature, but it became widely known only in the last 10 years or so. So there are various ways of understanding why this particular factor and why this factor of 2. One of many ways of understanding them, actually, let me just show you how it works first, how well it works. So mid-spectrum eigenstates behave like infinite temperature states. And then you have negative temperatures on this side, positive temperatures on this side. And then if I use eigenstates like this, then I can extend that page curve and get a full curve, which is this black curve. And that seems to fit the experimental data quite well. So this idea of representing finite temperature eigenstates by this construction really seems to work quite well, right? Again, there is some deviation which results from the deviation here, but that will get smaller if we go to larger sizes. Okay, where did this magic formula come from? There are various ways of understanding it. One way is what in probability is called concentration of measure. It essentially says that if you have an operator and take its expectation value in a large dimensional space, large dimensional Hilbert space, then if you take it for any random state, then to excellent probability up to measure 1, it's equal to the trace of that operator. So this goes by some other names in other communities, but it's one of the forms of what's known as concentration of measure. So I've used that for this combination operator, and that shows you that why I used a trace e to the minus beta half, right? So that's because there are two of these appearing here, and two of these appearing, one from the Bra and one from the Ket, and this reproduces the canonical expectation values. Okay, so having introduced this idea, I will draw one conclusion from it before moving on. The conclusion is that if you want to assign temperatures to energies, as that's the idea we were discussing, then the expectation value of an operator in an eigenstate should be well described by this, right? That means because the temperature is a smooth function of energy, we've seen the temperature energy correspondence. That means if this idea is correct, if it holds, then the left side, the expectation value in eigenstates should depend smoothly on energy. So this object should depend smoothly on the eigenenergy. So that's essentially the statement of the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis, which, having already motivated it, will come to next. Okay, so my next part, also relatively introductory, will be about the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. And
sorry, brief question.
Yeah, please.
Hi, Masud. So in the previous slide, are you sort of staying well within finite sized systems, or is there some subtlety associated to taking the thermodynamic limit because you use the cyclic property of the trace?
Good question. So I think concentration of measure is generally becomes valid. So this approximation becomes nearly equal for large dimensional Hilbert spaces. I don't know if there is any subtlety with taking the limit. I don't think so. But for any finite large system, this should work, and it should work better as you go to larger systems. I don't know if the L to infinity limit is singular in some sense. I never, that didn't occur to me. But this you're saying because I switched the trace, right?
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but of course, this is all very hand wavy. So I imagine that it probably works for arbitrarily large sizes. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk about the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis next. So this is about the question of whether an isolated system can thermalize. And again, I'll go through this fast, assuming a relatively specialist audience. So you could talk about this in terms of subregions of isolated systems thermalizing, and some people like that. So you can think of a region, part of your system, having the rest of the system acting as a bath. So yeah, but what we'll talk about is thinking about observables, which the one can be formulated in terms of the other. So in terms of observables, you think of it this way. And in fact, many observables do thermalize in generic isolated systems. So in terms of observables, you say that a system thermalizes if the value to which the observable relaxes is the same value that you'd get by the pretense that we did a few pages earlier, pretending that the system is a canonical, described by a canonical system. So what I've shown here is some cartoon of some observable which does some dynamics because it's out of equilibrium, and then it settles. And generally, most observables, generic observables, if the system is large enough, will settle to some value. That's just relaxation. I will call this thermalization only if that value, the average of that value, is exactly given by the canonical value. Well, I said exactly, but of course the at finite sizes, you just expect them to be close. So so let's look at those two slightly more in slightly more detail. So so the first quantity, which value it relaxes to, again, I'm using the notation that I introduced. I expand my initial state in terms of the eigenstates. And then when I do that, I can figure out what is the long time limit around which it settles. So I take the long time limit and I take an average, and you get this. And then on the other hand, when I say thermal ensemble, that's about the pretense that we talked about. There is no bath, but we pretend that there is a temperature, and then we use the canonical formula. And so beta is defined by inverting this, as we discussed before. And so thermalization means this equality between the relaxation and the thermal ensemble value, relaxation value and thermal ensemble value. And of course, this equation is totally mad, because this depends very much on the initial state. This depends on the pretense of a temperature existing, being well defined. And the only way you can really think of this being true in a wide variety of systems, I think, is that these expectation values are well behaved. And we've already said what type of well-behaved they should be. So that's more or less known as the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. There are other aspects to it, which we will gloss over. So you want this to be a smooth function of the energy. Okay. So I'm again assuming that people have seen this. I will give a quick example of this from, where is this from? This is from this paper, where you look at different sizes of a system. The system itself is not important. It's some non-integrable system. The observable is not important. It's some observable, which is not too non-local. And you see that the eigenstate expectation values plotted against the energies, they form a cloud which gets sharper and sharper as you go to larger sizes, and in the infinite size limit becomes infinitely sharp. So that's the statement of ETH, but it's a more quantitative statement now, because you can think of what the width is, right? And the scaling of the width is, you could just say that it's exponential in the system size, but you can make it a bit more precise. And you can you find that its dependence is d to the -12, where d is the dimension of the Hilbert space. I don't know how this generalizes to continuum systems which don't have a spectral upper bound. So I really need my spectrum to be finite so I can define d. So this is the scaling which you can argue in various ways. You can argue based on random matrix theory and the central limit theorem, and the various concentration of measure results in the literature also lead to this, right? So when I found this in 2013 or so, I was very happy about this new result, and then later discovered that there were variants of this existing in hidden in literature previously as well. So there are various ways you can argue this. Okay, so actually you can, so another part of ETH is about off-diagonal matrix elements, and it turns out that off-diagonal matrix elements, their values also, so if you have different eigenstates, their values also scale as this. So that's shown here. So really very nice scaling, where I cheated by taking a model with disorder and then averaging over disorder, so that you get extremely nice scaling. Good. So I think I will. So there is other ways of looking at it. So this is something that's hidden in one of the original formulations of ETH, which also gives you d to the -12. And this was derived from thermodynamic arguments. Okay, so I'm done with my two introductory parts. In the next part, I will ask which observables obey ETH, and in particular, I will take this form of ETH, the idea, sorry, maybe it's written better, the idea that both diagonal and off-diagonal matrix elements of the operator have width scaling as d to the minus half. Right? So that's, I will ask, defining ETH in this scaling form, I will ask which operators obey ETH. And in order to do that, I will first make a brief excursion into random matrix theory and then come back and answer this question. Okay, questions about what we had till now?
So I don't have one, but I mean, there was a question that I missed earlier, which was asking when you plot the matrix elements of the eigenvectors, and you said that they're Gaussian. The question was, are you plotting the real or imaginary parts?
Okay, so
or whatever, and I took the liberty to answer it, but why don't you also do it yourself?
Okay, so I guess the answer is that in that system, the coefficients are real, and generally, if you don't, if you have time reversal invariance in your system, your eigenstates are usually can be made to have real coefficients, and often in the most natural basis, they do have real coefficients. So in that case, it was just the real. But in cases where you have complex coefficients, both have Gaussian form. So yeah, I guess that's the answer. Okay, so so the next part will be asking about ETH scaling in different types of operators. And to do that, I will go back to random matrix theory just to show how we do the calculations here. So now a random matrix, I could interpret these as many-body basis states. So this is a random matrix showing its connectivities. Each node is one row or one column, and each connection is one off-diagonal term, right? Now, you could, there are two interpretations that are useful for this purpose. One is the many-body interpretation, and the other, which we'll first look at, is a single particle interpretation. You can think of the random matrix as the Hamiltonian of a single particle on a fully connected graph with random hoppings, right? So you could even write the Hamiltonian like this, although you might tell me it's overkill to use second quantization for a single particle, but you can do it. I mean, nobody stops you from this. And then these are hoppings, and those are on-site energies. The diagonal parts are on-site energies. Okay, with this interpretation, the system is really, really, really boring, right? There's not many things you could bother calculating. The only interesting observable is the thing that appears in the Hamiltonian, which is this. But let's think about that anyway. And so it's the node-node hopping or the on-site node energy, however you want to think about it. And this is the important thing. So it's really the thing that connects two different nodes of the system. Okay, good. So why is this important? We'll see in a minute. So as a matrix, if you write it as a matrix, then there is only one term in the matrix, which is non-zero, one, and the rest are zero. And if you write a Hermitian version, you can do that. Then it's a matrix with two non-zero elements. But any other operator for the system would be a linear combination of these, right? Because these are basis elements for in operator space. So that's why these will be important when we go to many-body systems, because constructing these gives us a basis for any operator, including physical operators. So let's do that. The many-body analogy is that these nodes, they are no longer single particles, but they are single particle orbitals, but they are many-body configurations, which I use this notation with italics actually. So the corresponding operators are these, right? So you take one many-body configuration and you change it for another many-body configuration. So that's the corresponding operator. So something that was very simple in the single particle case is a highly non-local operator in the many-body case. And because they're highly non-local, really highly non-local, we call them behemoths, meaning which is a biblical word for a huge land-dwelling beast. In Russian, behemoth just means a hippopotamus. So it's nice to have a behemoth in the title of a paper for Russian readers. So now we can think about operators in either random matrix theory or many-body physics. And once we have these, because these serve as a basis, so any operator you can express as a linear combination of these. So we'll do that in a moment. But before doing that, let me give examples of behemoths. What do they look like? So for a spinless fermion system, you could imagine a behemoth changing this state to this state. For a spin half lattice, you could imagine a behemoth changing this to this state. So it's really very non-local, completely changes the configuration. So going from one configuration to another, and so on. And if you want to write it in how do you say, creation annihilation operator, second quantization, then it looks horrible and it shows you that it's really a non-local operator. It's a 2 NP point correlator. Okay. So now what we're interested in is really local operators. So we can use our behemoths to, so any correlator, so some 2n, n is a smaller number than the system size or the number of particles in the system. Any such operator you can write as a sum of behemoths. And the important thing is how many terms are there. If the system behaves like a random matrix, then just by knowing how many random variables are you adding, you can tell a lot about the statistics of that object, right? So it's the number of terms in this sum which is important. So a behemoth is simply something.
Sorry, question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Can you go back to the previous slide, please?
Yeah.
Basically, you are not classifying these behemoth operators in terms of the distance between, say, the two furthest degrees of freedom that it changes, but only in terms of the number of real space sites on which it acts.
Actually, I'm not classifying them at all. I'm just saying this class of operators is the behemoth operators.
So when you say non-local, it could be say two real space sites which are far away from each other.
Yeah. So it could, in principle, just have all of these things common in the two of them, right? So so in fact, they could be the same as well. That would also be a behemoth. It would be a diagonal behemoth.
Okay.
Right. So there are some which are how do you say, accidentally, coincidentally not non-local.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And actually, the case that you just mentioned, if only one pair is different, in this expression you still have the other terms. So it's still not a 2-point correlator. You see so it's a complicated correlator. It's there are density terms for the other sites as well, which is not the same as just a 2-point.
But it could have been identities on the other sides.
Not sure what you mean. So
if I write down an operator which is, say, Ci1 dagger,
right.
Ci plus L by 2 dagger, which is extremely non-local in real space, but has operators acting on only 2 real space sites.
Yeah.
Would you call that a behemoth?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Isn't that the linear superposition of behemoth?
Yeah, of course, everything is a linear superposition.
Yeah, I know, but it has to be a linear superposition, not just one. That's the answer, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. That's the answer. So 2-point correlators you can express also as a sum of behemoths, and then you can do some counting to figure out how many of them you need, which I don't think I'll be able to do in real time. But if you do the counting, you get a combinatorial factor, which in the large size limit scales as order D. So it's D times something. So it scales as the Hilbert space size. So a 2-point correlator in the behemoth basis is actually quite complicated if you write it in the operator basis. Another way of asking is, saying this is, how many non-zero terms do I have in the operator matrix for a 2-point correlator? The answer is order D, which you can find out combinatorially. Okay. Now that you have this, you can figure out the distribution of matrix elements. How? So we are interested in matrix elements which are of operators which are sums of behemoths, right? So it's 1 behemoth, 2 behemoths, 3 behemoths, or m behemoths. Could be order D behemoths. So how do I figure out the distribution of those, that's what I'm interested in ETH, for ETH thinking. Well, if I assume that the system behaves like a random matrix, which we saw that many generic systems do behave like a random matrix, then instead of doing the many-body calculation, I could do a random matrix calculation or the single particle calculation in the other interpretation of the random matrix. And there I can calculate this because many of these objects are random variables, and I can express this as a sum over random variables. And there are ways of calculating the distributions of those. And here is the next 2 or 3 slides is the calculation, which I will skip, but it's simply a calculation using random matrices which are Gaussian. And you can find out that the Behemoth distribution, the Behemoth matrix element, is a product of 2 such things. So then you can calculate the distribution of a product of 2 Gaussian variables, which turns out to be a Bessel function. And then if you want a Hermitian operator, then you sum 2 of these. The sum of 2 Bessel function distributed random matrices like this turns out to have a exponential distribution. And the sum of several of them turn out to be more and more Gaussian. So you can think of that as visualizing the central limit theorem. You take some random matrices of a certain distribution, in this case, this Bessel function distribution. You add numbers of them, eventually you will get your answer will have Gaussian distribution. Okay, now that I have that, I can test it for a many-body system, and you find that in a many-body system, the Behemoths have exactly the predicted distribution. This is still not very interesting because this is really Behemoth distributions. What's interesting is, so sometimes things go wrong, but I will skip that. What's interesting is the scaling of local operators, right, physically. So here is a summary of the answers. The Behemoths have distributions which are Bessel functions, and the width of this scales as d to the minus 1. So even though the Behemoths are superbly non-local, they actually have super ETH scaling. They really, their width really goes down very fast. On the other hand, local operators, which we are interested in, have this many Behemoths, are sums of this many Behemoths. So you can calculate using the central limit theorem their width, and the width is d to the minus half. So this is an alternate perspective on the d to the minus half that we met before. A typical operator, which you might complain is not physical, is, you just make a matrix and let's say it's dense. You just fill up the matrix with random elements. That would be a mathematically or statistically typical operator, totally unphysical, but that would have generally more than order d non-zero elements because it's a d square element matrix, right? D by d matrix. So if the number of elements is larger than 1, then you have a sub ETH scaling, which you can work out. So this is perhaps only of mathematical interest. The physical interest is here, the middle statement. So this gives you the idea that this perspective of the ETH, by ETH I mean this particular scaling, is that the ETH works because physical operators are sparse, and more specifically, this particular scaling works because the local operators have approximately this many non-zero elements in the operator matrix. And of course, you can test this idea by looking at operators which are, this is just a Hermitian operator, 2 Behemoths, Hermitian Behemoth, which is 2 Behemoths. This is a few Behemoths, Behemoth operators, and a large, a few Behemoth operator, and this is the distribution. So these are all just distributions. This is the distribution of a local operator, which has this many Behemoth operators, local meaning 2-point operators. And you see the distributions work very well with the analytically predicted form, except when you sum many such operators, then you get the correct scaling. You see both of these are of the same order of magnitude, but the numerical factor is off. And that's to do with the fact that many-body eigenstates are not really random. right? So treating them as random, you get many things out, you get the correct scaling, but there is a partial violation of the central limit theorem because the variables that you deal with are not really probabilistic variables, right? Not the ones that you meet in statistics class, but containing some physics. So the central limit theorem gives you the correct scaling, but is off by some order 1 factor. So this is again something that allows me to be friends with those people who don't like thinking of many-body Hamiltonians as random matrices. So there is some deviation. And these scalings, you can look at them as scalings, and you see the deviation here between the green line and the purple line. And these are dense operators, which I guess we decided that are generic operators, but physically generally not interesting. Okay, so I think the last part went fast, but I'm trying to keep with the instruction to stop before an hour. So I will stop with this slide where I show some Behemoth distributions for systems that some people might be interested in here, many-body localized systems. So I draw this on a log-log plot to show that if you have small disorder, then in the ergodic regime, then you get a very good description in terms of Behemoths, in terms of random matrix theory. If you have large disorder in the MBL phase, then the distribution of Behemoths is a power law, a straight line on this log-log plot. And that's because in MBL system, eigenstate coefficients themselves have power law distribution, which is known, but not really widely discussed. And I don't really have a good explanation for why they have power law distribution, but a good understanding of why they have power law distribution. Maybe someone in the audience does. So the eigenstate coefficients having power law distribution leads to power law distribution of Behemoths as well, because you combine 2 power law distributed random variables, their product is a power law as well, right? You'd to get, yeah. So that's the sharp distinction from random matrix behavior in the MBL phase. Similarly, an integrable model also will deviate, and again you see a deviation which I don't really have an explanation for. Looking at the Hermitian version, it's not an exponential operator, but has some feature which I don't quite understand. So I don't have a good understanding of the eigenstates of integrable models in general, their distribution and so on. I don't know if many generic things can be said about that. Okay, I think I'm done. So I think I sort of rushed a bit through the last part, but I'm happy to answer questions about that as they arise. Very good.
Okay, thank you, Masud. Are there any questions? All right, if not, can you go a couple of slides back when you show this deviation in the histogram? Because I have a question here, yeah. For example. Next slide. Yeah. So, okay, I was trying to think while you sped through the slide, but so, okay. What you're saying is that, for example, if I look at the rightmost, top right plot, what you're saying is that the green line is the prediction, right, from the random matrix, and the black plot is the x-axis plus next nearest neighbor. And the so you're saying that this deviation is because the eigenstates of this model are not actually random numbers. The distribution might be Gaussian, but there's correlations in the.
Yeah. So the
random matrix.
The eigenstates are correlated in some way, yeah. Which is hard to, which I find difficult to characterize or put a number on. But you keep seeing these order 1 deviations in various quantities, which point to the fact that they're correlated. So the random matrix result, it does coincide with the green curve. The actual, if you did the same calculation with random matrix. Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now I was trying to think, can I remove this correlation to see what happens? But the only thing you can do is random matrix, and then it works. So actually, maybe I have that shown here. So there are too many things, but I think one of these
which coincide with the prediction is a random matrix one, which yeah. So there's the RMT prediction, and then yeah, it's the random so it's the last one, right? So that there I've taken the same operator, but I've used the eigenstates of an actual random matrix, and that matches. That's so it doesn't care about what operators I'm calculating. It the reason it's off is because the eigenstates are somehow physical eigenstates.
And I can't really see it, but the light blue should also be on the yellow line, yellow dots.
I guess it is the random operator. Yeah, it is. So so you can only see the colors, right?
I mean, I couldn't make out the dot between the green and the light blue. I couldn't make out, but
So
yeah.
I think what's here coinciding is this one,
and the green line.
RMT prediction.
Okay.
That I believe that's what you said, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then anything that you use the physical Hamiltonian, that those they don't follow anymore. They have some deviation.
Can I ask another question? So, okay, since no one is asking, can you go back to the definition of the behemoths, because I'm slightly confused about, say, an operator of the kind ci daggers ci plus 1, right? So that is a bona fide link or bond on the Fock space. But that is an operator you would not call a behemoth.
No, because I would call that. So let's say I have 5 or 6 sites, then I would. So a behemoth would be ci dagger c2, and then c3 dagger c3, c4 dagger c4, c5 dagger c5. Right. So a behemoth.
I see.
Can I make a comment, because I think study is thinking of c dagger I c3 as an operator, but actually it's cross one.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No. Yeah, but the cross one.
No, but that's important. That is important.
Right, because according to Masud, if you have cross ones, then that's not a behemoth operator.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it still is a
put in this form, right?
Right. So basically, you want non-trivial operators on every side.
Yes. Actually, if I write it in this language, it's as many particles as there are. So if NP is, if I think of them as spinless fermions, or spin half with spin up, then do I want non-trivial? I think I want as many operator pairs as there are particles.
Or probably you want, okay, but imagine you had a system with where the number of particles was not conserved, say. Then would it be enough to say that you have non-trivial operators on a finite fraction of sites?
Yeah, I think then you would need then you would have operators on every site. Yes.